Summer of 1988. The worst drought in 50 years. Every modern well in Finney County, Kansas, drilled 400 feet deep, worth $40,000, was either failing, burning out, or running dry. Every well except one, 38 feet deep, dug by hand. In 1891, the drilling company laughed at it in June. By August, that same company was standing in front of 60 farmers and apologizing. The difference between the well that survived and the wells that didn't? It wasn't technology. It wasn't money. It was something a man figured out by watching where his cows walked in the morning. The question is, why did it take a 50-year drought for anyone to listen? And what does a well dug in 1891 still have to teach us today? There are two kinds of water beneath the high plains of western Kansas. The first kind is ancient, 10,000 years old, pressed into sandstone and gravel by the weight of glacial rivers that no longer exist. Men call it the Ogallala. They drill 400 feet to reach it, spend $40,000 on the hole alone, and pump it at 1,500 gallons a minute to feed the corn that feeds the world. It is enormous. It is magnificent. And it is, in the way that all finite things are finite, running out. The second kind is young. It fell as rain last spring, or the spring before, and filtered down through limestone and clay until it found a shallow bed of sand and rested there, quiet and cold, 12 gallons a minute at most. Men do not get rich on 12 gallons a minute. They do not irrigate 1,000 acres on 12 gallons a minute. Most of the county had forgotten this kind of water existed. Alvin Purckett had not forgotten. He had been drinking it for 74 years. The argument started the way most important arguments in Finney County started at Henderson's feed store on a Tuesday morning in June 1988, with the smell of grain, dust, and diesel in the air, and half a dozen farmers arranged in the chairs around the cold iron stove like a jury that hadn't been told what it was deciding yet. Alvin had come for stock, salt, and mineral supplement. He had his list in the left breast pocket of his flannel shirt, written in pencil on a torn piece of paper bag, the way he'd been writing lists since his wife Martha died in 1979, and there was nobody left to write them for him. He'd been on his feet since 4 that morning. The June sun, already climbing hard by 8 o'clock, had burned the back of his neck on the drive over in the pickup. He was pulling his order from the shelf when the bell above the door jangled and Craig Hollenbeck walked in. You could always hear Craig Hollenbeck before you saw him, the particular quality of his entrance, the way his dress shoes struck the concrete floor with the confident percussion of a man who has decided in advance that every room he enters is better for his presence. Alvin had known Craig for 11 years. He was not a bad man. He was something more specific than that. He was a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that he had stopped considering the possibility of being wrong. "Gentlemen," Craig spread his arms toward the seated farmers as though greeting old friends at a reunion. He was 42, thick through the shoulders, wearing pressed khakis and a mid-plains drilling polo shirt with his name embroidered above the company logo. His white Cadillac DeVille, this year's model, with the Mid-Plains magnetic sign on the door, was visible through the window, parked in the shade of the feed store's overhang with the precision of a man who parks where he wants and expects the world to accommodate him. Gerald, Roy, Dutch. Craig worked his way through the room with handshakes, clapping shoulders, performing the choreography of rural friendliness with the ease of long practice. Then he found Alvin at the shelf, loading his bags. "Alvin, good. I was going to call you this week, actually." "About what?" Alvin said. "Your water situation." Alvin put the second bag of stock salt on the dolly and didn't answer. Craig moved to the counter and accepted a coffee from Pete Henderson, black, no sugar. The way he took everything, as if sweeteners were a weakness he'd overcome. He leaned back against the counter and looked at the room with the satisfied expression of a man about to deliver useful information. "I'll tell you what I told the Petersons last week," Craig said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "This drought is not going to break before August. I've got the USDA soil moisture data. I'm talking to the National Weather Service boys twice a week, and the picture is not pretty. Precipitation deficits running 28% below normal. The Ogallala is your insurance policy, gentlemen. The operations that have the deep infrastructure are going to come through this. The ones that don't, he paused, letting the silence do the work. The ones that don't, Dutch Minders said, are going to do what? Craig spread his hands. Struggle. That's the honest answer. He turned then, with a timing that seemed calculated, toward Alvin. Which brings me to something I want to say plainly, because I have too much respect for Alvin to dance around it. He pitched his voice to Carrie. Around the stove, chairs shifted. Alvin, that hand-dug well of yours, what is it, 30-some feet? 38, Alvin said. 38 feet. Craig smiled not unkindly, but in the manner of a doctor citing a test result that confirms a diagnosis the patient has been resisting. In a normal summer, that sand lens you're pulling from produces what, 10, 12 gallons a minute? 11 to 12. 11 to 12 gallons a minute. He let that number sit in the air beside the implicit figure of 1,500 gallons a minute that the Ogallala delivered. Alvin, in this drought, and we are looking at the worst since 1936, the data is very clear that shallow lens is going to see its recharge cut to nothing. No rain means no replenishment, and when it goes dry fast. I've seen it happen in '56. I've seen it happen in droughts smaller than this. He shook his head slowly, a man performing reluctant concern. I can put together a package full Ogallala system, 6-inch casing, submersible pump, pressure system, the complete setup for $43,000. First State Bank has agricultural emergency lending at 14% right now. Leonard Schrick, a large wheat farmer, 3 chairs from the door, turned in his seat and said in a carrying voice, "Hell, Craig, that old well's probably older than Alvin himself. I'm surprised it hasn't turned to mud yet." This produced the laughter Leonard was aiming for. Not vicious, Leonard wasn't vicious, but the released tension laughter of men under pressure who have found a target that isn't themselves. "It was dug in 1891, Alvin said. He said it without heat, without hurry, in the tone of a man reading a date off a headstone. By my grandfather, by hand, with an iron spade. With all due respect to your grandfather," Craig said, and the phrase landed with the specific weight of phrases that mean the opposite. Hydrology has advanced some since 1891. We understand aquifer dynamics now. We have data. We have satellite soil moisture readings. We have models that tell us exactly how these shallow sand lenses behave under sustained drought pressure. And what the models say is that a system like yours, with no deep connection to the regional aquifer, is the most vulnerable water source in the county when the rains stop. He paused. "I'd hate to see you hauling water in milk cans come August." "When did you last read Grass?" Alvin asked. A short silence. "I'm sorry, Grass. On the south face of a draw in July. What does it tell you?" Craig blinked. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The room watched him with the careful attention of men who have spent their lives reading exactly the things Craig had just been asked about. "I don't," Craig started. "Doesn't matter," Alvin said. He took the dolly handles and began moving toward the register. "I'll think about your proposal, Craig. It's a serious offer," Craig said, recovering his footing. $43,000 for complete water security. I'll leave the paperwork with Pete." He placed a manila folder on the counter with a solid, final sound. Then, to the room, with the easy confidence of a man wrapping up a point he's already won. "I'll tell you what, Alvin. I'll give you $100 for that old well housing. Good seasoned oak like that, it's worth something to a woodworker. Put it toward the deposit on the new system." Alvin took his change from Pete, loaded his bags in the truck, stood for a moment at the driver's door in the June heat. He said without turning around, "That well is not for sale." He drove home. Behind him, he could imagine the conversation continuing inside, Craig laying out his proposal with the brisk confidence of a man who considers the outcome already decided. Leonard Schrick laughing again, Gerald Foust looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who doesn't entirely disagree with what he just heard. Alvin pressed down on the accelerator. He had something to show the drought before it was over. 10 days later, the Finney County Agricultural Cooperative held its monthly meeting in the basement of First Methodist in Garden City, and 51 farmers came, 14 more than the usual attendance. People were scared. Scared people fill more chairs. Craig Hollenbeck was at the front with a projector and acetate slides. He showed precipitation deficits. He showed aquifer levels. He showed yield projections for irrigated versus non-irrigated operations in drought years. The numbers were real. The graphs were accurate. The conclusion that the Ogallala was the only viable answer to the county's water security needs was stated with the confidence of a mathematician announcing a proof. The operations with full Ogallala access, Craig said, clicking to a slide that showed yield comparison bars, are projecting 60 to 70% of normal yield, even in this drought. The operations without that access are looking at 40%. Maybe less. He paused. The choice between those two outcomes is largely a function of infrastructure investment. The question period came, and with it Leonard Schrick, who turned in his chair with that carrying voice and said, "Craig, what about the folks still using stock ponds and hand-dug wells? You figure they're just gonna pray for rain?" Laughter moved through the room. Craig smiled and raised one hand. "I would never suggest prayer as a water management strategy," he said, and the room laughed more. "But look, I respect the history of how people farmed this land. Some of those old systems worked fine in a wet year, but we are not in a wet year." He clicked to a map of the county's wells, color-coded by depth. The handful of shallow or hand-dug wells appeared as pale yellow dots scattered among the deep blue of the Ogallala infrastructure. Those yellow dots are what we might call legacy water sources. Some of them are working right now. Some of them aren't. The question is, what happens in August when the sand dries out? He looked at the map with the expression of a man delivering a verdict that pains him. "I won't name names, but I'll say that there's at least one farmer in this county who is going to find out in a very hard way this summer that 1,891 technology is not 1,988 technology." He didn't look at Alvin. He didn't need to. 20 heads turned toward the back of the room. Alvin. This from Kyle Peterson, a young farmer in his mid-30s. He said it with genuine concern. "Have you thought about Craig's proposal?" "Seriously?" "I've thought about it," Alvin said. "Same as I've thought about it every time Craig's brought it up over the last 11 years. And," Kyle pressed, "and my grandfather dug that well by hand in 1,891 inches, the exact spot the land told him to dig it. In 1935, in the worst drought year of the Dust Bowl, it produced 6 gallons per minute, while 3 drilled wells in this county went dry entirely." He spoke without drama, in the flat, declarative way of a man reciting things he has verified personally. It produced 6 gallons per minute because it doesn't tap a static deposit. It taps a sand lens fed by local rainfall through limestone caprock. It's not big water, but it's living water. And living water doesn't stop when the rain slows down. It slows down with the rain, and then it recovers with the rain. The room was quiet. 6 gallons a minute, Leonard Schrick said, and the tone he used managed to make it sound both like a concession and a mockery. "Alvin, I run 1,200 head. 6 gallons a minute wouldn't water my dog." "You're not farming my land with my cattle," Alvin said. "Scale matters. And the question isn't how much water I can deliver per minute. The question is whether I'll have any water at all in August." He paused and looked directly at Craig for the first time that evening. "I'll tell you what, if my well is still producing in September, still producing water on the ground, no hauling you come to the October cooperative meeting and explain to this room the difference between a fossil aquifer and a locally recharged one. Just the science. That's all I ask." Craig stared at him. "And if your well fails?" Craig said. Then I'll stand up at the October meeting and tell everyone they should have listened to you 11 years ago." He held out his hand. Craig looked at it for a long moment. The whole room held still. Then he stepped forward and shook it. Alvin drove home in the warm June dark with the windows down and the smell of dry prairie grass coming through the cab. He didn't think about Craig Hollenbeck or the 51 farmers in the church basement. He thought about his father. Harold Purckett had died in 1962, in the same farmhouse where he'd been born, in the same bed where his father Ezekiel had died before him. He had been a quiet man, quieter than Alvin, which was saying something, and his form of intelligence had been the patient, accumulated kind that doesn't announce itself in conversations but makes itself evident over decades in the health of soil and the quality of livestock and the small adjustments in practice that prevent the large disasters before they begin. He had left two things of consequence: the farm and a composition notebook. The notebook sat in the second drawer of the roll-top desk, in the study. Alvin had read it so many times that certain passages came to him unbidden, the way song lyrics do. But he went to the study anyway, took the notebook from the drawer, and opened it to the 1,936 entries. He read his father's words the way you reread something important, even when you have it memorized, because there is a difference between knowing words and receiving them. His father had written, "Another dry month. Third year of the Dust Bowl. The well is down 9 feet from normal, sitting at 29 feet but still giving water at 6 gallons a minute. I water the stock twice daily and run the house on what's left. The Reinhardt place, 1 mile east, went dry in March. They left last week for California. Their well was 110 feet deep, drilled in 1920. Big water, fast water, good water in a normal year. But it tapped a sealed sand pocket with no connection back to surface recharge. Once you pull it down, it doesn't recover. Not in a year. Not in 10. Father's well at 38 feet holds because of where he put it. He watched the grass for 3 summers before he picked the spot. The low corner of the south draw, where the cottonwoods grew tallest, where the cattle walked first thing in the morning, when they had their choice of the whole pasture. He understood that ground is not uniform, that water underground follows its own valleys and collects in its own low spots, and that a man who reads the surface will know what the subsurface is doing. The sand lens at the bottom of our draw feeds from the limestone rise to the north. Even in this drought, rain falls somewhere on that limestone and finds its way down through the rock into the sand. Not much rain, not much water, but some, always some. It is a living system, not a dead deposit. I have been thinking about the difference. The Ogallala, the big aquifer, is like a savings account accumulated over 10,000 years. You can draw from it and the balance falls, and one day you will draw from it and find the balance gone. Father's well is like a regular income. Less money, but it comes back. In a dry year, the income is small. In a wet year, the income is generous. But it does not stop, because rain does not stop. Not forever. Rain always comes back. The Reinhardts were good people. Their well was 110 feet deep and served them well for 16 years, but they borrowed $800 to drill it, and when it dried up they had no water and they still had the $800 debt. Father dug his well for $12 in iron and rope and his own 2 arms. In 1936, when the world is dry, Father's $12 is feeding 30 cattle and keeping us alive. Know what you are spending. Know what it costs to lose it. And never spend what the land cannot replace. Alvin closed the notebook. Outside, the June darkness was absolute. He went out to the well and lowered the weighted string he kept on a nail beside the housing. Counted the knots. 38 feet to water normal level. 12 gallons per minute when he'd drawn that morning. He stood in the dark with the smell of well water on the rope, cold, mineral, the faint limestone taste of it, and felt the satisfaction of a man who has placed his faith in something that has not yet failed him, and that he has reason to believe will not fail him. "All right," he said, to the well, to the limestone, to the sand. He went inside and went to sleep. The drought of 1988 came into its full power in July, like a door opening onto a furnace. Temperature records fell in the first week 104 degrees, 106, and on July 11th, 109. The heat was the dry, mineral heat of the high plains at its worst, a heat that simply removed all moisture from the world with the flat efficiency of physics from the surface of the skin and the top of the soil, and the leaves of the corn, with equal, impartial completeness. Gerald Foust's operation ran on 2 water sources, a stock pond on the east section and a drilled well at 80 feet. By July 8th, the stock pond had fallen to a foot of standing water, green and warm with algae. By July 14th, Gerald's drilled well was making a short, irregular cycling, running 3 minutes, stopping, running again that the pump technician from Garden City identified immediately. The water table had dropped below the intake. The pump was pulling air. Gerald called Alvin that evening with the careful voice of a man reporting a thing he wished he didn't have to report. "How deep is your intake set?" Alvin asked. 68 feet. "Well, bottom is at 80. What does the tech say the water table's doing?" "He figures it's dropped 30 feet since spring. 12 feet of margin left before the pump runs dry completely." At a sustained drop rate through a continued drought, 12 feet of margin could disappear in 2 to 3 weeks. "I'll run a gravity line from my overflow tank," Alvin said, before Gerald had asked. "Half-inch copper, along the fence line. You'll get 3 to 4 gallons a minute from my well's overflow. It won't save your corn, but it'll keep your horses alive." A long pause on the line. "I'd pay you," Gerald said. "No. Alvin, it's just water, Gerald. There's enough." On July 22nd, a Wednesday, with the temperature sitting at 107 degrees and no cloud visible in any quarter of the sky, Gerald Foust's drilled well pump burned out its motor entirely. Alvin found Gerald standing at the well casing in the furnace heat, with a wrench in his hand and the control panel open, looking at the burnt contactor with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he has been dreading. "Water table dropped another 6 feet, Gerald said without turning. "Tech was out Monday, said it was at 72 feet. My intake is at 68. Pump's been pulling air for 3 days. He closed the panel. I just didn't want to believe it." Alvin looked at the well casing, then at Gerald's pasture, where 18 Hereford cattle stood in the inadequate shade of a single cottonwood tree. Their ribs were beginning to show. Their eyes had the dull, patient, suffering look of large animals that cannot communicate their need and have learned to wait. "How long to get a new motor?" Alvin asked. 5 to 7 days. Minimum from Oklahoma City. And then the tech has to pull the whole pump assembly, lower the intake 16 feet. Gerald stopped, swallowed. "I'm looking at 3 weeks without this well. 3 weeks, 107 degrees, 18 head of Hereford cattle. We run the line heavier," Alvin said. "I've got 3/4-inch copper in the shed. We can double the flow to your stock tank, maybe 6 to 7 gallons a minute. It won't be comfortable, but it'll keep them going. Your well can handle that draw. I'll manage it in 2-hour windows and let the lens recover between. The limestone is still routing water down. Not fast, but enough." He picked up his hat from the fence post. "Come on, let's get the line." They spent the afternoon in the brutal heat running copper tubing along the fence line, soldering joints in the sun while sweat dripped off their noses and the metal itself was hot to touch. Alvin was 74 years old and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who has learned to budget effort the way he budgets water. No movement wasted, no energy spent on drama, each action placed with precision. Gerald, younger by 7 years, was the one who had to rest twice. By 4 in the afternoon, water from Alvin's well was running through the copper line and into Gerald's stock tank, 6 gallons a minute. Not the 1,100 that the Ogallala systems delivered, but enough. The cattle came to the tank in groups of 3 and 4, drinking long and steady, their flanks pumping with the relief of animals that have been truly thirsty. Gerald stood watching them for a long time without speaking. "Thank you," he said finally. "Your grandfather helped mine sink fence posts in 1924, Alvin said. "We've been square for a while." 3 miles away, Craig Hollenbeck was having his own kind of difficult day. He had gotten a call that morning from Kyle Peterson's operation reporting that the center pivot irrigation system had stopped. When Craig arrived, the cause was a combination of 3 simultaneous failures. The pump motor was overheating because the water temperature at depth had risen as the aquifer absorbed summer heat. The electrical control panel had developed a short circuit from the combination of heat and dust infiltration, and the GPS guidance system for the pivot arm had lost its satellite signal due to ionospheric interference from the extreme heat event. 3 problems arriving together on the day the corn needed water most. Craig sat in Kyle's kitchen and looked at the repair estimate. $4,200 for the motor, $800 for the panel, and 2 to 3 days minimum wait for a replacement GPS control board. 2 to 3 days, Kyle said. "My corn is in pollination, Craig. This week is the week. 4 days without water during pollination." "I know," Craig said. "I need it fixed today. The motor I can have here tonight, I've got one in the truck. The panel we can bypass. But the GPS, what do I need a satellite for?" "The pivot arm makes a circle. It doesn't need to talk to a satellite to make a circle. The control system won't run the arm without a valid GPS signal. It's a safety interlock. My grandfather's equipment didn't need a satellite to water a field," Kyle said. Craig had no answer for that. He called the manufacturer. He called the regional distributor. He found a technician in Liberal who could work around the interlock. The technician arrived the next morning. By then, the critical window of the pollination period had passed. Kyle's corn yield that summer would come in at 40% of normal. That evening, 18 miles away, Alvin Purckett's well produced 11 gallons per minute. No GPS required. The following Thursday, Sharon Dreier drove up Alvin's lane, a woman in her late 40s with the practical, spare look of someone who has spent a lifetime doing physical work and stopped feeling the need to apologize for it. She ran sheep on 400 acres east of Holcomb. Her drilled well at 60 feet was still producing but pulling slow, the water table down 42 feet with 18 feet of margin left and falling. "I've been looking at my own property," she said, standing in his garden while he watered tomatoes with a green metal can. "There's a corner on the southwest section, rough ground, rocky. I've ignored it for years, but the grass there is still green. Everything else is brown. That corner is green." Alvin set the watering can down. "Show me," he said. They drove to the southwest corner of her property, which was rocky and difficult and which Sharon had written off mentally as useless ground. The grass was not lush, but it was significantly less burnt than the surrounding fields. A subtle difference. The kind of difference a person could drive past 100 times without noticing, and then notice once and never unsee. Alvin got out and walked the corner slowly. He noticed where the land sloped slightly, almost imperceptibly toward a low spot in the southwest. He noticed a single old cottonwood tree, its trunk thick and its canopy spread wider than any cottonwood had a right to be on ground that looked this rough. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. The ground gave very slightly under his hand. "You've got a sand lens under this corner," he said. "I'd guess 25 to 30 feet. It's feeding from that limestone ridge on your northwest boundary. That ridge collects rain from the section over and roots it down through the limestone into whatever's under here." He looked at the cottonwood. "That tree has been drawing from it for decades. It doesn't tap the Ogallala. The Ogallala is too deep for cottonwood roots. It's tapping shallow water, and it's alive." Sharon looked at the tree, then at Alvin. "Could I dig a well here? Have a geologist confirm it. But yes, I believe you could put a well here at 30 feet and have water year-round from local recharge." He paused. "It won't be big. 8 to 10 gallons a minute. But it'll be yours. Not borrowed from 10,000 years ago." Sharon stood quietly with the green corner of her brown field around her. "Why didn't anyone tell us this?" she said. It wasn't anger. It was a genuine question. "Craig Hollenbeck told you the Ogallala was the answer," Alvin said. "He wasn't wrong for most of the county, but he only knew the one answer, and nobody thought to ask whether there were other questions." The first week of August was the worst. The National Weather Service issued heat advisories for southwestern Kansas, temperatures exceeding 100 degrees for 14 consecutive days, overnight lows that refused to fall below 80. The word drought had been replaced in news coverage by the phrase worst since the Dust Bowl, which had the quality of all statements that are accurate but insufficient. The Mississippi River ran so low that barge captains filed reports about sandbar groundings. Yellowstone burned. In Finney County, the suffering was specific and agricultural and mostly invisible to the rest of the country. Gerald Foust sold 20 cattle. He did it on a Tuesday, loading them at dawn when it was only 92 degrees, driving them to the sale barn himself because he couldn't pay the hauling fee. He got 62 cents a pound, about 70% of what the cattle would have brought 2 months earlier, before every struggling farmer in a 3-state area tried to liquidate inventory simultaneously. He drove home through the August heat with the trailer empty and sat in his kitchen for an hour before he could make himself get up. He called Alvin that evening. 20 head, he said. "I know," Alvin said. "Core breeding stock is intact?" "Yes. I kept the best cows and the bull. I'll rebuild in 2 years. You'll rebuild in 2 years, Alvin agreed. "Good land and good stock." "Craig's system would have prevented this," Gerald said. "Not an accusation, just arithmetic." "Possibly," Alvin said. "Or it would have given you more corn that you couldn't sell at a profit, because every other irrigated operation in the county was also producing corn, and the price was down 40%. A long pause. "How's your well doing?" 11 gallons a minute. Water table at 33 feet. Down 5 from normal, but stable. Alvin paused. The limestone did its job. Even in this heat, the caprock is routing what little rain falls on it straight down into the sand. On August 8th, Alvin sat at his kitchen table in the early morning with the Garden City Telegram and a piece of paper and a pencil. He was reading a USDA assessment of the Ogallala aquifer buried on the agricultural page, a dry, technical piece that most readers would have skipped. The article contained a number: 4 feet. The average annual decline of the Ogallala water table in Finney County over the current decade was approximately 4 feet per year. Alvin put the newspaper down and picked up the pencil. He wrote on the paper, 180 feet current, saturated thickness, Finney County, Ogallala. Then, 4 feet per year decline. Then, 180 divided by 4 equals 45 years. He wrote, 1,988 plus 45 equals 2,033. He sat with 2,033 for a while. He was 74. He would not see 2,033. But children being born in Finney County this summer would be 45 years old then, middle-aged. The age when a man's life is built, when his farm is his and his debt is his and his future is visible from where he stands. Those children would stand on land that had no Ogallala water, not because anyone was dishonest, not because Craig Hollenbeck was wrong about what the Ogallala could deliver today, because 4 feet times 45 years is 180 feet, and 180 feet is the aquifer, and arithmetic doesn't negotiate. His 38-foot well would be here in 2033. Producing less, the climate was shifting. But producing. The sandlands didn't accumulate over 10,000 years. It accumulated over last winter, and it would accumulate over the next winter too, because the limestone didn't care what year it was. Limestone caught rain. Rain always came back, not in the amounts men wanted, not always when they needed it, but always, eventually, back. He folded the paper and put it with the notebook in the second drawer. Craig Hollenbeck arrived at Alvin's farm on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of August, without calling first. Alvin was at the stock tank when he heard the Cadillac on the gravel. He didn't turn around. He heard the door close. heard the footsteps cross the dry yard. "Your well is still running," Craig said. "It is," Alvin said. A pause. The water coming up through the pump was cold enough that a faint mist rose from it where it hit the hot stone of the tank. "Gerald Foust's pump burned out," Craig said. "I know. I'm running a copper line to his stock tank. From this well." Another pause. Longer this time. The professional certainty in Craig's voice had changed in character, less the tone of a presentation, more the tone of someone genuinely trying to understand something that has been resisting his understanding. "How many gallons a minute are you producing right now?" Craig asked. 11, Alvin said. "Down from 12 in a normal summer. Water table at 33 feet, which means you have 14 feet of margin to the bottom of the usable sand." "Yes." Silence. A meadowlark called somewhere in the brown grass. "I'd like to understand the geology," Craig said. "Not for a sales call. He stopped. "I've been doing this for 12 years. I've installed over 400 wells in this region. But I realized this summer that I've been solving a volume problem and ignoring a sustainability problem. And I don't fully understand how your system works." He paused. "Will you show me?" Alvin looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from the fence post. "Come with me," he said. He led Craig up the slight rise to the north of the house, 100 yards in the August heat, to where the limestone outcrop showed through the thin soil, gray-white and layered, running roughly east to west across the upper edge of the property. "This is your caprock," Craig said. "The rain that falls on this ridge percolates down through the limestone and follows the slope underground. The limestone acts like a funnel. It collects from a catchment area of about 400 acres and roots everything down into the sand at the bottom of the draw. That's where the well sits." He turned. "My grandfather noticed that the grass in that low corner stayed green 3 weeks longer than anywhere else on the property in dry summers. He noticed the cattle walked there first thing in the morning when they had free range. He noticed a cottonwood growing there that was twice the size of any other cottonwood on the property. He spent 3 summers watching before he picked the spot. Then he dug 38 feet by hand, and when he hit cold sand at the bottom, he stopped." Craig was looking at the limestone with the expression of a man recalibrating. "The recharge is local," he said, "not connected to the Ogallala at all. Completely separate. It recharged last spring from local rainfall, the spring before that, going back further than either of us can calculate. And in a drought year, the recharge is reduced, but not stopped, because it doesn't require the whole county to get rain. It requires 400 acres of limestone catchment to get some rain." He paused. "The Ogallala gets recharged from the Rocky Mountains, hundreds of miles away, over thousands of years. This well gets recharged from last April. Which one recovers faster when the drought breaks?" Craig was quiet for a long time, looking at the limestone with the specific focus of a professional encountering a category of problem he has not previously mapped. "I've been in this business for 12 years, he said finally, "and I have never had a client walk me through the local recharge geology of their property." He paused. "I have never asked." "No," Alvin said, "because I had an answer that worked most of the time. And when a man has an answer that works most of the time, he stops looking for the times it doesn't." "That's right," Alvin said. Craig stood looking at the limestone for another long moment. Then he turned to face the well housing in the draw below the weathered oak cover, the hand-cranked windlass, the 38 feet of rope descending into cold sand that a man had spent 3 years finding before he spent $12 digging to it. "The October meeting," Craig said quietly. "I'll be there. And I'll say what needs to be said." The drought broke in the first week of September, with a front that moved through over 2 days, delivering 3 inches of rain. Not enough to undo the summer's damage. Not enough to refill the stock ponds or restore the corn or unsell Gerald Foust's 20 cattle. But rain. Real rain. Soaking rain. The kind that seeps rather than runs. Alvin measured the water table that afternoon. 36 feet. Up 2 feet from the August low of 33. The limestone caprock, drinking in 3 inches of rain and routing it through 400 acres of catchment, had already begun returning water to the sand below. He noted the measurement in his notebook. September 3rd, 1,988. Water table 36 feet. Recovery has begun. 58 farmers came to the October Cooperative meeting, the most anyone could remember in a decade. Word had gotten around the way word travels in rural Kansas, through feed store conversations and fence line exchanges, and the relay of people whose livelihoods are close enough together that information moves like weather. What had gotten around was a fact, not a story. Alvin Purckett's 38-foot hand-dug well had produced water through the entire summer of 1,988, through the worst drought since the Dust Bowl, while other wells, good wells, modern wells, expensive wells, had failed or faltered or required emergency repair from manufacturers in other states. The fact gathered additional facts as it traveled: that Alvin had run a copper line to Gerald Foust's cattle, that Gerald's cattle had survived, that the well at 38 feet was back to 12 gallons a minute now that September had brought rain. Craig Hollenbeck stood at the front of the room without his projector. No acetate slides, no color-coded maps, no USDA yield comparison graphs. "In June," he said, "I told you that the Ogallala was the answer to water security in this county. I told you that shallow and legacy water systems were inadequate for drought years and should be replaced." He paused. "I was right about the Ogallala. It is the right answer for most of the large-scale irrigated operations in this county. But I was wrong about something more fundamental." The room was very quiet. "I was wrong because I was solving a volume problem and ignoring a sustainability problem. I was thinking about how much water a system could deliver per minute, and I wasn't thinking about whether that delivery was sustainable over decades. And I was dismissing older systems built by farmers who read their land before they ever put iron in it, as obsolete technology, when in fact they were expressions of local geological knowledge that took generations to accumulate, and that I simply didn't have." He looked at Alvin, sitting in the same seat he'd occupied in June, back row, near the door, hat on his knee. Alvin Purckett's well at 38 feet produced 11 gallons per minute through the summer of 1,988. It watered his 42 head of cattle. It supplied water to Gerald Foust's stock through a gravity line for most of August. It never failed. It never required a service call. It never needed a replacement control board shipped from a manufacturer in another state. He paused. It did these things because Alvin's grandfather read the grass and the cottonwoods and the cattle trails on that property for 3 summers before he picked a spot and put a spade in the ground. He looked around the room, 58 faces looking back. The Ogallala is far deeper, far larger, and far more reliable in the near term than any shallow system. I stand by the Ogallala infrastructure for large-scale irrigation. But at current extraction rates, the Ogallala in Finney County is declining at approximately 4 feet per year. The current saturated thickness is about 180 feet. He stopped. "You can do that arithmetic yourselves." Several people in the room did. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of people reorganizing something they believed. "I should have told you that in June," Craig said. "I had the data. I chose not to lead with it because I was here to sell a product and the depletion problem is bad for sales. That was wrong." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at the room. "Going forward, my company is committing to provide every client with a full local recharge assessment before recommending any well system. If your property has shallow recharge potential, you'll know about it. A local recharge well won't replace the Ogallala for large-scale irrigation, but for stock water, for drought backup, for household supply, it can be the difference between a farm that survives and a farm that doesn't." He sat down. Roy Beckham said, "Thank you, Craig." Then, "Alvin, do you want to say anything?" Alvin stood, put his hat on. Craig said what needed saying, he said. "I'd add one thing. The people who built this county before us read this land slowly, over years, before they committed to it. We have better tools now, better data, better machines, but the land still rewards reading. It rewards patience and observation, and the willingness to accept that what's under your ground is different from what's under your neighbor's. He looked around the room. Learn your ground, that's all. He sat down. The following Sunday, Gerald Foust came to dinner, and Ruth came too, which meant there was apple pie with a crust that Alvin had been eating for 30 years and privately considered the finest in the western half of Kansas. They ate at the kitchen table with the windows open to the September evening. I hired a hydrogeologist, Gerald said, when the pie was finished. The one Craig recommended. She's coming next month to look at the northeast corner. Good, Alvin said. If there's something there, I'll put in a shallow well. Keep it as backup for the stock. He was quiet a moment. I should have done it years ago. You didn't know the question to ask, Alvin said. Neither did Craig. Gerald looked at his coffee cup. 20 cattle. It set me back 2 years in the breeding program. You'll rebuild. You said that before. I'll keep saying it until it happens. Ruth Foust, who had been listening to this exchange with the patience of a woman who has heard variations of it for 40 years, said, Alvin, if you'd had Craig's deep well system, would anything have been different this summer? Alvin thought about it honestly, because Ruth deserved an honest answer. My operation would have been the same, he said. I don't run enough acreage for the deep system to make economic sense. Nothing would have been different. Except I'd have had a $43,000 debt. No debt, Ruth said. Never had debt on this farm. My grandfather paid $12 for the well. My father paid for everything as he went. I've done the same. He paused. The freedom to make decisions slowly, to wait out a bad year, to refuse a bad price, to keep cattle when everyone else is selling comes from not having payments to make. You can't put a number on that freedom, but it's real. Ruth nodded, and Gerald nodded, and the September evening came in through the screens with the smell of the harvest and the beginning of the season's cooling, and nothing more needed to be said. The well is still there. It stands in the side yard of the Purckett farmhouse in Finney County, Kansas, in a housing of weathered oak boards rebuilt twice since Ezekiel Purckett first put timber over the hole he dug in 1891. The hand-cranked windlass that Alvin rebuilt in 1971 is still in place. The rope is newer, changed every 10 years, which is Alvin's granddaughter Kate's practice now, continued from her father Thomas's practice, continued from Alvin's practice before that, continued from Harold's practice before that. The rope descends 38 feet into cold sand and comes up wet, the way it has come up wet every morning for 133 years. Alvin Purckett died in January 2001, on the farm, in the house his father was born in, without debts and without regret. Gerald Faust's northeast corner, assessed by the hydrogeologist in the fall of 1988, contained a limestone-fed sand lens at 31 feet. Gerald installed a shallow well there in the spring of 1989, and it produced 9 gallons per minute through the drought of 1996 and the drought of 2011 and every dry summer since. Sharon Dreier's southwest corner well, dug in 1990 at 28 feet, produces 8 gallons per minute in a normal year. It waters her sheep and her kitchen garden and her grandchildren when they visit in summer and splash in the stone trough she had built beside the well housing, their feet on the wet grass of the one corner of her property that has always been green. The Ogallala Aquifer in Finney County in 2024 is approximately 144 feet lower than it was in 1988. The 4 feet per year figure that Alvin calculated on a piece of paper at his kitchen table in August of that summer has proven accurate. Several center pivot irrigation systems in the southern part of the county have been decommissioned because the aquifer below them is no longer economically pumpable. The children who were born in Finney County in 1988 are 36 years old. They are exactly where Alvin's arithmetic said they would be. Craig Hollenbeck retired in 2004. In a letter he sent to Thomas Purckett that year, he wrote, "Your father changed how I thought about water. Not with an argument, he was not interested in arguments. He changed it by being right, quietly, for long enough that the rightness became undeniable. I have spent the last 15 years of my career trying to ask the question he taught me to ask. Not how much water can we extract, but where does this water come from? And will it still be coming in 40 years? I don't always have a good answer, but at least I'm asking the right question now. Thomas keeps that letter in the second drawer of the roll-top desk, alongside Alvin's folded piece of paper with the number 2033 written on it, alongside Harold's composition notebook, alongside Ezekiel's first 16 pages of careful observation about grass and cottonwoods and where the cattle walked. On the morning of October 14th, 2024, Kate Purckett lowers the weighted string into the well at 5 o'clock, while the pre-dawn sky lightens from black to gray-blue over the limestone ridge to the north. She counts the knots. 41 feet. Notes it in the notebook. Stands for a moment with the wet rope in her hands, the cold smell of sand-filtered water rising from the dark below. She thinks about the number her great-grandfather wrote, 2033. She thinks about what will still be here, what won't. She puts the notebook in the second drawer and goes to start the coffee. Outside, the limestone ridge catches the first light of morning. Somewhere within it, last month's rain is moving through limestone, through clay, through the spaces between grains of sand, finding its way down to the cold, dark place where Ezekiel Purckett stood in 1891 with an iron spade and an unreasonable amount of stubbornness and decided here, right here, this is where the living water is. He was right. The rain comes back. It always comes back.